Hey guys, so today we are going to be going over the major 7 Supreme Court cases and why they are relevant to our government and how they shaped it.
Plessy v. Ferguson was a landmark 1896 U.S. Supreme Court decision that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. The case stemmed from an 1892 incident in which African-American train passenger Homer Plessy refused to sit in a car for blacks. Rejecting Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights were violated, the Supreme Court ruled that a law that implies merely a legal distinction between whites and blacks was not unconstitutional. As a result, restrictive Jim Crow legislation and separate public accommodations based on race became commonplace.
Marbury v. Madison, a legal case in which, on February 24, 1803, the U.S. Supreme Court first declared an act on Congress unconstitutional, thus establishing the doctrine of judicial review. The court's opinion, written by Chief Justice John Marshall, is considered one of the foundations of the U.S. constitutional law.
It was a legal case in which, on March 9, 1964, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously that for a libel suit to be successful, the complainant must prove that the offending statement was made with actual malice. That is, with the knowledge that it was false or with reckless disregard of whether it was false or not. Specifically, the case involved an advertisement that appeared in the New York Times in March 1960 that outlined how African Americans had been oppressed and asked readers to contribute money to the struggle to end racial segregation in the South.
Miranda v. Arizona. In 1963, an immigrant named Ernesto Miranda was charged with the rape and kidnapping of a girl. During his arrest, his Miranda rights weren't read to him, therefore wasn't informed of his rights to remain silent or his right to an attorney. The defendant argued that Miranda had experience with legal procedures and was fully aware of his rights as he negotiated with knowledge and understanding of the situation that he was in. The court was split 5-4 when deciding or not Miranda's rights had been violated. The majority opinion believed Ernesto Miranda's Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights had been violated, and his conviction should be overturned. After this case, it protects the due process. This case did not add, take, or change the Constitution. It just made it so law enforcement had to make sure suspects were aware of their constitutional rights, specifically the Fifth and Sixth Amendments, before being questioned.
The Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision was the Supreme Court's ruling on March 6, 1857, that having lived in a free state and territory did not entitle a slave, Dred Scott, to his freedom. In essence, the decision argued that as a slave, Scott was not a citizen and could not sue in a federal court. On this day in 1857, the United States Supreme Court issues a decision in the Dred Scott case, affirming the right of slave owners to take their slaves in the Western territories, thereby negating the doctrine of popular sovereignty and severely undermining the platform of the newly created Republican Party.
In Gideon v. Wainwright, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution requires the states to provide defense attorneys to criminal defendants charged with serious offenses who cannot afford lawyers themselves. The case began with the 1961 arrest of Clarence Earl Gideon. Gideon was charged with breaking and entering into a Panama City, Florida pool hall and stealing money from the hall's vending machines. At trial, Gideon, who could not afford a lawyer himself, requested that an attorney be appointed to represent him.
He was told by the judge that Florida only provided attorneys to indigent defendants charged with crimes that might result in a death penalty if they're found guilty. After he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, Gideon filled out a habeas corpus petition to the Florida Supreme Court, claiming that his conviction was unconstitutional because he lacked a defense attorney at trial. After the Florida Supreme Court denied his petition, Gideon appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which reviewed his case.
Brown versus Board of Education, which was a 1954 Supreme Court case. It had a huge impact on our country. Ultimately, it just put an end to segregation of children in public schools, racial segregation. They marked it as unconstitutional. It pretty much revolved around the separate but equal doctrine. And that line was based off of Plessy versus Ferguson and the Jim Crow laws. And what that was is it basically barred African Americans from sharing the same buses, water fountains, schools, and other public facilities as whites. Eventually, though, Oliver Brown, a plaintiff, he did file a class action suit against the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. This was because his daughter, Linda Brown, was denied entrance to an all-white elementary school. In his lawsuit, he claimed that schools for black children were not equal to the white schools. The case went before the U.S. District Court in Kansas, which agreed that public school segregation had a detrimental effect upon the colored children and contributed to a sense of inferiority, but still upheld the separate but equal doctrine.